So the Diamond article, Jared Diamond, the worst mistake in human history, is about this switch to farming. Why? And so he gives sort of two main views. The progressivist view and the revisionist view. So the progressivist view is the sort of the mainstream idea that many of us have probably heard, or it's at least implicit, that the shift to farming was good. To ask why is a stupid question, the progressivists would say. It represented progress. That's one way you can keep the word straight. Things got better, they got easier. Foragers were no longer sort of on the edge of the mercy of the environment, the edge of survival and starvation. They knew where their next meal was coming from, and it was easier, it was less work. That's what the progressivists would say. How do you actually prove that life got better with the shift to farming? You look at the evidence. And so if you look at the archaeological evidence, which we can do, we can tell, we can date the shift from when people were foraging and shift to farming. The evidence shows things got much worse in terms of health, disease, well-being, equality, or lack thereof. A few people might have benefited, but for most of us, things got much, much worse. This is the revisionist view, right? A revision of this idea that it was progress. The revisionist view would say that agriculture didn't equal progress. In many ways, it brought really negative consequences. Again, inequality, disease. They would sort of say, well, why did people switch? One thing going on 12,000 years ago is that overall, we entered the Holocene, our current geological epoch. We're actually in the Anthropocene, but for another day. Overall warming of the climate that happens at the end of the last glacial period 12,000 years ago. The result is warmer, more stable climates globally. And so it made farming probably more viable because more stable, warmer, you can grow in these conditions. And then the revisionists also suggest, and the debate is out on this one, that maybe there was some population pressure going on. The people, hunter-gatherers aren't stupid, they're incredibly smart. They know that plants grow from seeds. They could have farmed, they could have started gardening anytime they wanted. They didn't. So why is the question? And again, the jury is out. One hypothesis is there was some population pressure. And if you have more mouths to feed, you have a couple of choices. You find a way to limit the population, or you find a way to feed more people. So again, jury's sort of out. Yeah, Layla.
It just kind of reminds me of something that Nai said in the video, where she was talking about how they were forced to settle. They had all kind of gotten sick, and it was going really badly for them because they were used to being able to leave disease behind in the lifestyle that they were in.
Yeah, nice observation. And so among hunter-gatherers, like Layla was saying, if let's just say a virus or a parasite or a disease comes along, the cold or the flu, well, you get someone sick, there's a band of 20 people, and then maybe a few people have some natural immunity pretty quickly, right? That disease has spread through all the hosts in that band. And then where else are you going to go, right? There's nowhere else to go because these bands are spread out geographically. And so that's it. There's no pandemic, there's no epidemic, it ends there. It took large, sedentary, crowded populations that came with farming to get epidemics, pandemics, right? The bubonic plague, COVID, right? That's one reason for vaccinations, is to stop transmission in these large populations because we're not geographically separated. So sort of to create some separation to break the lines of transmission. So yeah, this wasn't a thing for hunter-gatherers. You run out of hosts. Farming provided the proper breeding grounds for these large diseases, epidemics, and COVID being a perfect, sorry that it's the current example, but a good example of exactly that. Good. Okay, and so the revisionists, again, they would say, we're not sure. The climate got warmer, so it made agricultural viable. And then maybe some population pressure, because agriculture does have one definitive advantage over foraging, and that's that you can provide more food per unit of land, and thus you can support larger populations. Think about it. With hunting and gathering, let's say you have an acre of land, there's only so many edible plants and animals in the landscape. But with farming, you've converted the landscape into all edible plants, right? Because you're cultivating them. So you can support a lot more people. Even though you can support more people at a given time, farming, contrary to popular belief, did not provide a more secure food source. Hunter-gatherers, they rely on game, on wild plants, sour plums, mongongo nuts. Oh, so-and-so, this isn't coming in. That's okay, we'll go get some mongongo nuts. In other words, they had a resilient resource base, diversified, a lot of different things they could rely on. Farmers put all their eggs in one basket, so to speak. So you're concentrating on growing one, maybe two cereal crops, rice, wheat, corn, whatever it is. If something goes wrong, the rains don't come. A pest comes along that feeds on that crop and wipes out your fields, you're screwed, basically. You have no backup, no fail-safe. So famine, large-scale starvation and death from not having food, that doesn't become a thing either until farming emerges. Okay, so there's sort of two main consequences of agriculture that I want to tease out. Okay, so social inequality. This one's kind of straightforward. I want to talk more about the health implications. So again, surplus, right? Freeing people up. You only need a few people farming to produce enough food to feed everyone. This frees people up to specialize. Agriculture allowed a single farm family to produce a surplus over and above their own needs. This has consequences, right? Specialization frees people up to do other things. Agriculture also supported the rise of permanent settlements. People are no longer moving around. They start accumulating wealth. With sedentism and specialization, you start getting differences in status and differences in wealth. This is the root of inequality, literally, agricultural surplus. And then the surplus can be traded, sold, taxed. It supports people that themselves don't farm. Rulers, aristocrats, priests, warriors, etc. The other main change has to do with health. Like, there's a lot you can tell from just the skeletal remains of past populations of fossilized human remains. Things like tuberculosis, syphilis, these different things actually leave a marker on the bones that archaeologists can then infer what was going on with the overall diet, health, lifestyle of this group of people at the time. So I'll give you a few examples, a few of the main changes. And Diamond talks about this too. One, settlement size increases. You start getting these large sedentary populations. Kind of already covered it, but it leads to this increase in endemic infectious disease, right? Things like influenza, things like COVID. Again, it couldn't, like as Layla pointed out, it couldn't take root in hunter-gatherer groups. This is also prior to modern sanitation. And so because people aren't moving around anymore, essentially people and their waste are staying in the same place. And so hygienic conditions really deteriorate. You start getting things like waterborne illnesses like cholera, other pathogens that get in the drinking water, make people sick, dehydrated, even die. This last change has to do with changes in diet. So hunter-gatherers had a diverse, healthy diet, right? Relying on, dozens of different plants and animals with different micronutrients and minerals and amino acids. And when people shifted to farming, those that did, they had a really simplified diet, eating maybe 1-2 cereal grains. They're not getting this diversity of minerals and nutrients from wild plants anymore. So protein intake goes down big time. And again, the diversity of the diet, the nutrients, the minerals, the stuff we all need, the building blocks, they're just not getting it. So you start seeing evidence on the bones of malnutrition. So examples from the archaeological record. The first one I have for you is dental caries. And so caries is Latin for rottenness. Carie it's a fancy word for a cavity, right? A dental cavity. So you can see a picture of that here. And with the shift to grain-dominated diets, a diet high in carbohydrates, those sugars create acid in your mouth, on your teeth. And that acid erodes the enamel, that protective layer on your teeth. That's what allows infections to get in, i.e. cavities. So we start seeing a huge increase in dental caries in the archaeological record when people started farming. Look at this, sort of under the tooth. That is an abscess. And so dentistry, actually, we should be grateful for it, because if you ever had a toothache, and infections in your tooth don't work their way out, they work their way in. So they eat inward. And so that's what you're seeing here, is this infection that never got dealt with ate its way in through the bone, creating this sort of abscess right there. Another one, which let me pull up the whiteboard really quick. You're going to get another beautiful artistic drawing from me. Okay, so this is a tooth. Just take my word for it. And this is something called, for short, linear enamel hypoplasia. So when the body is undergoing nutritional stress, you're not getting enough nutrients, calories to carry out all your functions, the body will respond by putting energy towards the most important functions, like keeping your heart beating or something like that. And it'll divert resources away from less critical functions, such as enamel formation on the teeth. And so when people undergo periods of nutritional stress, it actually can leave a mark on the teeth, especially for younger people whose teeth are still developing. And you get these lines across the teeth where the enamel stopped forming for a period of time. And so each of these lines across the teeth, again, linear enamel hypoplasia, it shows a period of malnutrition that this individual underwent. When proper nutrition is restored, the enamel starts to form again. And then you can actually count up how many episodes of malnutrition the individual might have went through. Okay, and then one other example, this one, parodic hyperostosis. So parodic hyperostosis sort of refers to that skull that was already on the page. I'll talk about these eye sockets in a minute. Malnutrition, one of the things that farmers, they're eating less protein. And one of the main sources of iron is protein. And if you're eating less protein, you're not supplementing that, you're not getting enough iron. Iron is critical in the formation of hemoglobin, which is a protein in your red blood cells, responsible for transporting oxygen around your body. So when you're not getting enough iron to produce enough hemoglobin, your body's struggling. It's not transporting oxygen as much as it needs to. Your body compensates. Because the red blood cells aren't sort of able to do their full job, the hemoglobin in the red blood cells carries the oxygen around. Your body compensates and responds by trying to produce more red blood cells overall, to compensate for that sort of lack of hemoglobin. And so the regions in the body, sort of the areas of the bones, that these are the areas in which red blood cells are produced. And so what you're seeing on this porous, sort of spongy portion of the skull is parodic hyperostosis. It's an expansion of the surface area for red blood cell production. That's what your body is doing. It's trying to create a larger surface area to produce more red blood cells to compensate for this malnutrition, this lack of iron, anemia in the diet. This other picture is related to parodic hyperostosis. See those bony, spiny projections coming out of the back of the eye sockets? And I want to know what it felt like to be, well, I don't want to know what it felt like to be this person. I'd imagine you feel that at some point. It's the same thing, but just a different manifestation. You're seeing the regions of the bone where red blood cells are produced, trying to increase surface area to produce more red blood cells. And that's how it manifests. Health, malnutrition, all these things really declined with agriculture. By and large, things might have got a little nicer for some of the elites, right? The 1%. But for most everyone else, things got much worse in terms of inequality, disease, health, well-being, and overall sort of, decency of life. Sort of this idea of the price of progress, right? Progress for who, right? What's the price tag of that? Okay, and this brings us to the second great transformation in human society, the Industrial Revolution. So we've got enough time. We'll get through what we need to today. If I gloss over anything, don't let it give you anxiety. I'm making the test, and I promise I'll be fair. So if we have to sort of skip through a thing or two, don't stress about it, okay? Industrial Revolution starts a couple hundred years ago. This is essentially we start using fossil fuels. Consequences of the Industrial Revolution. Here's the agricultural revolution. This is global population. We see a slight increase with the shift to farming. Here's the Black Death. And then right after 1750, we see this exponential, unprecedented explosion in human populations, so that it was in the hundreds of millions after the start of farming. It went up to 100 million, a couple hundred million. By 1825, just 50 years or so after the Industrial Revolution started, we're at 1 billion. And a few years ago, we hit the 7 billion mark. Actually, based off fertility rates, population's probably going to stabilize here in the middle of this century. So keep that in mind when you hear people talking about that we have a population problem instead of a distribution or an inequality problem. And so the Industrial Revolution, the most pervasive, powerful transformation, it changed life as we know it. It's a combination of two key changes. One, changes in technology and how we are using resources. Industrialization, basically the use of fossil fuels and machines to produce. Before that, we were limited in how much energy we could harness to sort of human energy, or maybe a little bit of solar or wind or animal power. With fossil fuels, we have unlocked these vast storehouses of stored energy that we can burn, and it do a ton of work for us. So changes in technology, and then changes in social organization. This is sort of the emergence of capitalism. The private, prior to this, people sort of had their own land, right? Some, not doing great necessarily, but people kind of had their own plots, a way to sort of eke out a livelihood. With capitalism, ownership of land, of the means of production, it becomes concentrated in the hands of just a few people. A handful of people make most of the decisions. Think Coca-Cola. After class, go look up what Coca-Cola owns, right? Pretty much everything, right? This idea that there's, all these different companies producing, it's an illusion. That diversity is an illusion. 40,000 products on the supermarket shelves, that's produced by a handful of companies, right? Watch Food Inc. if you're not sure what I'm talking about. And so this change in technology and the way we're organizing, sort of who gets to control the economy, is known as industrial capitalism. And that's sort of the world that we're all familiar with. Hasn't been around that long. A couple of characteristics. So for example, the US, Sweden, Japan, we subsist on intensive and more specifically industrial agriculture. So people are farming, but they're using fossil fuels, pesticides, herbicides, all these technologies to sort of produce more food than you could with just human labor power. Implications: population size has exploded. Communities can be huge, in the millions and even billions. Social organization, stratified. We're class-based, right? We have inequality built into the system. We'll talk more later in class about that, promise. Leadership is based off class, sort of where you're born, ability, bloodline, who you know, and meritocracy with a question mark after it. Because do we really live in a meritocracy? A meritocracy meaning your merits, your efforts, your skills are what get you to the top. And I'll leave you to think about that for now. System of exchange, market exchange. And you don't need to know much about that. We're going to get into it sort of after the exam. But we exchange goods and services on this sort of abstract market using some sort of medium, cash in our case. Control maintained through bureaucracy, police, sort of this idea we have laws, you're supposed to follow them. If you don't, punishment. Okay, consequences of this shift. And again, we'll sort of, don't worry about what I skim through. There's certain things I definitely want to leave time for. Agricultural intensification. We are growing massive amounts of food on our land and not without consequences, right? One farmer feeds 120, 150 people. So it's really efficient from a production standpoint, but we're able to do that because we're using tons of fertilizer, tons of pesticides, tons of herbicides to grow this food. The result, we're destroying the environment, right? Polluting our waterways, our air, killing our wildlife. Social consequences, right? The people, for another day, but let's just say the food that comes out of it, processed food, it's literally killing people, right? That it's so unhealthy. Obesity, type 2 diabetes, these things don't exist in a vacuum, right? It's the food that is being pushed on us. Greater density. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, a lot of people lived rurally and sort of had their own land, right, to make a livelihood. Now we see this shift towards urban density. People are moving to cities. Most population growth in the future is going to be in the major cities of the developing world, right? Because people's lands have been taken. They've been pushed off of their lands into more marginalized areas, basically coming into the city to try to find work, to try to survive. Increased scale, and I want to elaborate on this. Huge increase in the size of our communities, the complexity, right? The number of different parts, the technology, the use of, we're using more resources and energy than ever before, made possible by fossil fuels. And so one specific sort of consequence of increased scale that I want to explain, and this argument comes from an anthropologist, John Bodley. That's who I stole The Price of Progress from. He sort of breaks humanity into these three worlds, the tribal, the imperial, and the commercial world. You can think of the tribal as like the Kung, the imperial as like Aztecs, intensive farmers, and the commercial world kind of like us, industrialized nation states. So what he says is that as you move from the tribal to the imperial to the commercial world, we see an increase in scale. Things get larger and we see an increase in complexity, and also an increase in the concentration of social power, meaning decision-making. Our leaders that make decisions that affect all of us, that's becoming concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And so at this point, cultural evolution is really no longer about meeting the needs of humans. It becomes what he says fundamentally a political process. Decision makers, elites, he calls them, start making decisions that are good for them and their wallets, perhaps, but not really good for the rest of us, that are maladaptive to the broader society and environment. Let me give you two examples. For those of you that have heard of Rex Tillerson, he was the Secretary of State in 2016 for about a year under Donald Trump. Before he became the Secretary of State, he was the CEO of Shell Oil. He left with like several $1 million bonus, I think, before he walked into the White House too. And he is very pro fracking, a way to get natural gas. So he's pro fracking. But a few years ago, he was involved in this Supreme Court case in which he was suing a fracking company to keep the fracking company off his ranch in Texas. Right. So he's pro fracking, frack it up everywhere. Who gives a frack? Sorry, couldn't help it. But not on my land, not on my ranch, not on my property, not near my children's health. That's what Bali means when he says elites make decisions that are good for them, but not the rest of us. And then elites are largely not in contact with the consequences of their choices, right? Because either they aren't aware of the negative impact these decisions have, or because they're not affected by it, they don't care and they don't correct for it. And he says these maladaptive behaviors, trajectories we end up on, it's not easily corrected, right? One other quick example, Texas, the storm, the winter storm. And so the power grid went out. So all these people a lot of people died because they didn't have sort of backups. So when the heat went out in their homes, all sorts of problems, right? People died, don't have power. The reason the power grid went out, it had been privatized by a handful of sort of rich men that stood to make a ton of money off of that. And so they deregulated it, meaning we have regulation to keep people safe. Like you're not allowed to just dump your toxic sludge in the river. You have to clean up properly, or you're not allowed to pay your workers 1 cent per hour unless we'll get into that later. There has to be a minimum wage, right? To keep some of these abuses in check. And so they privatized the power grid in Texas. A handful of people make a ton of money off of it. And because they deregulated it, there was no rules for safety or infrastructure or say a winterizing the equipment in case a winter storm came along. So when the storm came, the system crumbled. It fell apart, right? Because they hadn't built in sort of these fallbacks, these safety mechanisms, because that costs money and that cuts into their profits. So they just didn't do it. Elites make decisions that benefit themselves, but are not by and large good for the broader society or the environment, right? That's one of the consequences of this larger scale. Decision-making has become so removed. It's by and large maladaptive. One other consequence, this concentration of wealth power, like Bill Gates is worth like 80, 90 billion dollars. He gives a lot of that money back, but a lot of other people don't, right? They keep it. They siphon it off and keep it for themselves. Quick polling question. Take a guess. The richest 50,000 households, which isn't a lot, right? That's like a very small 0.1% of our population. Richest 50,000 households in the US own what percent of the wealth? The answer is 60%, but 50,000 households in the US, that is equivalent to 0.08% of our population. So you're talking about less than 0.1% owns 60% of the wealth in this country. Like, mind-blowing. Here's the global distribution of wealth. The richest 20% across the globe have over 80% of all the wealth. The second richest 20%, about 11%. The middle, 2.3. The bottom, sort of fourth 20%, a little under 2. The poorest 20% have access to 1.4% of all the wealth, right? This is one of the consequences of increased scale. 60% of the world, right? The bottom 60% has just about 5% of the wealth. Right? Population problem or distribution problem. I want to introduce pastoralists to you, but there's one key thing I want you to take away from it, and then that's it. So we're going to go quickly through here. Pastoralists are herders. If you look at the habitat types, dry savanna, the desert, semi-arid, these are sort of different groups around the world. So a couple of things about pastoralists. They acquire their food by taking care of their animals, right? And then subsist off the milk, the blood, sometimes the meat, the dung, the other products that the animals produce. Common animals kept by them, cattle, camels, sheep, goats, sort of herd animals, reindeer, llamas. And where we see pastoralism, it occurs in varied environments, but one thing that they all have in common is it occurs in regions that aren't very good for agriculture, for farming. This is because herding has several advantages. So it happens in deserts, grasslands, savannas, Arctic tundras, places, again, not suitable for farming. Cultivation's risky in these areas because the growing season's too short, the rainfalls comes one year, but it doesn't come the next. And so it's not reliable. And this is the key thing I want you to take away. Most of the vegetation of these grasslands and arid savannas in the tundra is not digestible by humans, right? We can't eat grass. We can't digest it in the same way a herd animal can. But the animals, the livestock, can eat this grass or shrubs or whatever it is, eat this vegetation that humans cannot digest. And then the animals eat it and transform it into edible products for humans, right? Milk, blood, fat, muscle. And so livestock provide, so it's a way to survive in an area where none of the food is actually edible to you, right? The animals eat it, transform it into products humans can then eat. It also provides insurance for crop failures. And I'm just gonna skip through this. I want you to take away what I just said. You can support larger populations too than you can with hunting and gathering. Overall, the settlement or the organization, it's flexible and it depends on the group we're talking about, but they're a little bit nomadic. They move around to different pasture land. They have some systems of inheritance, especially cattle, which is wealth. So they have sort of defined property rights, but also it's loose, it's flexible. Sometimes their leaders are inherited, right? Like picked by ranked, or sometimes it's sort of achieved. It depends on what group we look at. So overall, it just depends. It's flexible. 19th century unilineal evolutionists thought pastoralism was a stage between foraging and settled agriculture. Why? Because it kind of looks like that, right? They're big, larger than foragers, but not as big as agriculturalists. Some achieve leadership, but some ascribed. It sort of looks like a middle stage in many ways. But it's not. Most anthropologists argue that pastoralism comes after agriculture. And so kind of the point, the simplified economic framework we looked at today, the strength is it helps us analyze and focus on modes of livelihood as a way to understand what leads to the diversity, right? How people adapt to their environment and how that affects population size, social organization, all these other things. The weakness is that it kind of looks like, and it can be construed as this hierarchy of societies, right? Like this one, and then the next one comes, sort of this idea of progress. And that's not what we're doing. And that is not the point. All frameworks have problems. The Chumash, they're a hunter-gatherer group, but they have a huge population, money, possessions, semi-permanent settlement, and a slave class. The Chumash, as hunter-gatherers, because they live by the coast, so they have a more permanent supply of food from the marine life, rather than living inland and having to follow game animals. So where do they fit? They don't really fit anywhere on that typology, right? And what about fishing people? We haven't even talked about that. Where do they fit? So all frameworks have flaws and limits, and it's good to recognize those and work within those rather than ignore them.